stream of folks coming in. It's good.
Perfect. I feel like we have a few people who just all joined us, so and a few more coming in. So I'm gonna add them in. Okay. I think we're gonna let folks jump in as they come in, but we're gonna get started. And thank you so much for everyone joining us today. We have a nice big group of, it looks like 35 of us, which is nice on a Tuesday, especially around lunchtime. So we appreciate you taking the time to come here and speak with us and learn a little bit with us for this hour and a half.
Yeah, so we could go ahead and get started and we'll just keep admitting folks as they come in. Like Yesenia said, thank you all for joining us. Our presentation is on the educator's role in disrupting the school to prison pipeline. So we're going to go ahead and get started and hope that this is engaging and you all get to learn along with us.
Gabby, you're a little low on the audio.
And I apologize in advance for my audio. It just has not been working for me. How is it now, Yesenia?
Better.
I'm just gonna have to talk loud myself. So I apologize in advance. You know, technology through virtual learning is always an issue. So bear with me and thank you for your patience.
Yesenia, it's possible that you may have to pull from your mic a little bit because we have to put Gabby up so high that your mic is coming in louder. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, cool. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So just to talk a little bit about what we're going to be going over today. So we're going to go into a little bit of introductions, head into a Jamboard session, talk a little bit about the context and definitions of the school to prison pipeline, and also get into the data and what this looks like in the classroom. Close. So there'll be a lot of opportunity for us to talk together and to kind of share ideas. So we're excited about that piece. And yes.
All right. So before we get started, we always like to see who's in the Zoom room with us, right? So if in the chat, you could just start adding your name, your pronouns, and your affiliation, right? If you're a student, a community member, a professor, what institution you're coming from, please feel free to share that in the chat just so folks get to see who's in the Zoom room. And then Yesenia and I will also introduce ourselves. So first and foremost, Yesenia and I are from the HSI Caminos project at Cal State Long Beach. So Caminos project is a grant-funded program that is dedicated to increasing the number of Latinx teachers within our communities, and really helping all students who are preparing to become teachers to be culturally responsive educators so that they could better serve Latinx community and communities of color within our school systems. So my name is Gabby. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the academic coach for Caminos. So my role is really to speak to students, make sure they are on track, answer any of their questions, oversee our peer mentors. So we're really a support network for students so that they can succeed and thrive through their preparation to become teachers.
Yeah, thank you, Gabby, for sharing a little bit. And just my name is Yesenia Hernandez, and I'm the program coordinator for Caminos, and my pronouns are she, her. And to give you kind of a little bit of a background of where kind of this topic started for us, we regularly hold workshops, seminars with our and so some of them are maybe first years in undergrad who know they want to become teachers up to folks who are already in the credential program. And so what we do is we together, Gabby and I put together different topics we want to get into. And so we understood that this was really important for us to talk about. And so from that, we were asked to also lead other presentations related to this. And it kind of has grown from there. So we're really excited to kind of have this conversation. And kind of the mantra we have with Caminos is to really hold space for our future teachers to talk about some of these hard topics and really get them prepared before they ever enter the classroom to have these questions already and do some of that inner reflection. And so thank you for everyone who's sharing in the chat. I could see there's folks from students to professors to current teachers. So it's good to have a good mix of everyone in the room because that leads to just great conversation. So think if you haven't already had a chance to put your name, pronouns, your affiliation, do that now. And what we're going to transition next to is getting a little bit into what our first impressions are when it comes to the school to prison pipeline. So I'm going to be putting a link in the chat for a Jamboard. So everyone should be able to click on that. And so we want you to just share on there what comes to mind when you think of the school to prison pipeline. So I'm going to share the link a couple times so it doesn't get lost. It doesn't get lost in here. And then we'll see everyone in the Jamboard. Okay. Perfect. So I see folks are joining there now. If you haven't used Jamboard before, essentially you're going to be clicking and adding notes onto there. So feel free to, we have a little arrow that is supposed to help you kind of find that little note section and just whatever comes to mind, feel free to make a note, put it on there, and we'll kind of talk through kind of what comes up for everyone.
If you see here on the left hand side, there's like a sticky note. If you click on that, the sticky note will pop up. You can pick what color you want. You can add your note here, and then you can post it. So we encourage you all to please just, really post your thoughts on here.
Again, there's no right or wrong answers, just our impressions of what we think of when we hear about the school to prison pipeline.
And we'll take the next couple of minutes for you all to go ahead and do that.
So I see, we can see that there's policing in schools, systemic racism, something that it's not talked about too many schools don't prepare students for after high school life that can result in misguided teens heading to prison. Inequitable practices regarding discipline, socioeconomic status. Some folks sharing in the chat because they can't reach the link, talking about discipline rather than counseling. Institutionalized racism, low expectations for children of color. Okay. A frequent pattern that indicates a racial bias between students and teachers. Students with special needs having difficulties in school and with authority that can lead to erodive behaviors that send them to jail.
And we want to thank you all for engaging with us on this platform. This will stay up for the entire presentation. So as folks think of things, you can feel free to come post something on here, even as we're moving through the presentation. All right.
So I think the great thing here is that folks have they have a base knowledge of some of the things that are happening. And I think really our presentation is going to be able to kind of walk through some of those major points and get to some of the data. But yeah, I think it's good because when we get into this topic, we all have knowledge that we can hear. And Gabby and I like to say, this is something that, we're not experts in this field, but we care about this because we're invested in our students. And so we're doing the work to make sure that the information that we research and the information that we gather, we share with as many people as we can.
And Yesenia and I are also very intentional when we create these presentations that we're not only providing context and background and data, but that we also leave room for discussion and dialogue at the end, because that's where the learning piece happens. So throughout this presentation, we're gonna front load a lot of data and research, but hopefully with at the end being able to have some sort of discussion. So we're gonna go ahead and move forward. Thank you all for engaging with us on that platform. Now we're going to move on to some definitions, right? So Yesenia and I compiled this definition of the school to prison pipeline, which is at its base a system of policies and practices that push students out of the school and into prison, right? And it's really a pipeline that represents at an intersection of complex issues, right, that revolve around race, class, education, and the American justice system. So we also thought it would be a good idea, not just to talk about it, but there are folks who have created material and videos that really give a well-rounded summary of what the school to prison pipeline is. So I'm actually going to share that with you all now. It's this video from Vox, and it's about 3 minutes long. And let me go to that now. And you should all be able to hear.
There's this phrase that you might hear in the news sometimes, the school to prison pipeline. It's shorthand for how schools are funneling students, especially Black students, into the criminal justice system. It started in the 90s when schools responded to fears about crime with zero-tolerance policies, which mandated suspensions and expulsions for certain violations. They also cracked down on little things like talking back or uniform violations. The hope was that it would keep bigger problems from bubbling up. But as a result, out-of-school suspensions have doubled since the 1970s, and they keep increasing even though juvenile crime rates have now been dropping for years. Around the same time, the number of police officers stationed full-time inside schools has increased by a third between 1997 and 2007. Ostensibly, they were there to prevent mass school shootings like the one at Columbine, but they end up being a way for schools to basically outsource discipline to the police. Schools with officers have 5 times as many arrests for disorderly conduct as schools without them. Sometimes the results are shocking. But the less visible effect is that schools are feeding the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Consider the fact that schools are more likely to have an officer on their campus if the student population is more than 50% Black. You might assume that that's because there's more crime at these schools, but although students at police schools are more likely to be arrested, they're not actually more likely to be charged in court for weapons, drugs, alcohol, or assault, at least according to one study. During the 2010-2011 school year, 1 in 6 public school students in the US were Black, but they accounted for 1 in 3 arrests at school. Same goes for other forms of school discipline. Black students are suspended or expelled 3 times more frequently than white students. It actually begins in preschool. 18% of preschoolers are Black, but of all preschoolers suspended more than once, 48% are Black. Studies show that differences in behavior can't fully account for these disparities. Black students and white students are sent to the principal's office at similar rates, but Black students are more likely to end up with a serious punishment. One study found that white students are more likely to be suspended for provable offenses like smoking or vandalism. Black students are more likely to be suspended for subjective offenses like talking back or insubordination. Students who are suspended in school are more likely to later drop out or get arrested, so the federal government is asking schools to make suspension and expulsion the absolute last resort. In Oakland, California, public schools are trying something called restorative justice, where both parties in a conflict talk it out with a counselor instead of relying on punishment. The results are pretty encouraging. In the last 10 years, chronic absenteeism is down, and graduation rates are up in the schools that have tried it. Other cities and districts are also trying new policies. They're hoping that if their students end up in the criminal justice system, at least it won't be because the schools pushed them there.
Okay. So Yesenia and I really wanted to show this video because it laid down a really general foundation for the rest of what our presentation is going to be speaking about. And it already gets us in that mindset. It gives us some, hard to watch visuals, but it's, the reality of the situation that we're in. So that already puts us in the mindset for the next hour and gives us a base understanding of some of the elements of the school to prison pipeline. As we continue, we're going to get into much more specific data.
And I saw in the chat that a lot of folks were really interested in the video, and I think the link was shared there. And a lot of folks were surprised. And I think that's why we like this video, to be able to kind of see a visual representation of, things we may see in the classroom now or have heard of in the news, but seeing it in person in that way, I think is really important. And so to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this, right, we're talking about how the school to prison pipeline is made up of various policies, like the zero tolerance policies that were mentioned that lead to school suspension, and ultimately the criminalization of youth. And this pushes Black and Brown students out of the classroom. And there's also an increase of funding for police that feeds back into the criminalization of youth. At the same time, there's a lack of funding for counselors, nurses, and other critical resources that schools need. And I think, it's important here to talk about the context and influence of, white supremacy, where history and knowledge and power of white society is favored, valued, and upheld. And this fuels systemic racism, right, that methodically undervalues the knowledge from communities of color. Sorry, I'm going to mute some folks that can hear audio. Sorry, folks, if you could please mute yourself. Okay. And so this fuels, right, systemic racism that undervalues the knowledge from communities of color, communication styles, as well just has a general deficit view of students of color. And I think it's important here to know also that the detaining and imprisoning of youth has been increasingly privatized. And I know we talk about the privatization of prisons more kind of in the context of prisons for adults, but I think it's important also to note that this trend is also happening in juvenile detention centers, and that's a big issue that a lot of folks are pushing back against, to understand that folks are making money off of imprisoning our youth. So we're going to get deeper into some of these concepts, and I'll leave it open for Gabby if she wants to add anything here. But this is a huge system, right, with a lot of different moving parts that all kind of fuel each other and lead students further and further outside of the classroom.
Yeah, thanks, Senia. And something that we were very intentional about was really grounding this information, grounding this presentation in the larger systems at play, right? So schools do not exist in silos, right? Prisons do not exist in silos. There are larger structures and systems and ideologies at play, like Yesenia mentioned, like white supremacy, racism, capitalism, that are all contributing to the school to prison pipeline and allowing it to survive, right, to be. So we wanted to make sure to ground that in this context, because the school to prison pipeline doesn't just happen. And also, I'm not sure if folks have questions, right? But if you do, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try to address them as best we can. So now that we have, grounded the school to prison pipeline in these systems, and really making it clear that there are racial and ethnic disparities when we speak of the school to prison pipeline. So here's some data. This is actually data from 2009, 2010, but still very relevant 10 years later. And we're able to see disparate discipline rates. So in this graph that we have here, we see that white students make up 51% of the student population, right? Black students make up 18%, Hispanic make 24%, Asian Pacific Islander make 6%. But as we move right across the graph, we see a the representation of folks that are in school suspensions, out of school suspensions becomes disparate, right? So you see an overrepresentation of Black students getting in school suspensions, right? Even though they're only 18% of the population, they represent 35% of the students that are being suspended. That further increases to out of school suspensions to 55, right? So you see an overrepresentation of Black students in these disciplinary actions. And even though they are not the majority representation of students across the country. On the right-hand side, right, we see another infographic where you see that Black students are 3 times more likely to be expelled than their white counterparts, and 4 times more likely to face multiple suspensions than white students.
And another piece also here that's important is to kind of see this over time. So this graph here shows suspension rates by race, starting in 1973 to 2006. And we can see here that it's actually the problem is getting worse. For Black students in particular, they're being suspended at higher and higher rates. And then we can see below them that American Indian students follow, then Latino students, and then white and Asian students. So I think, it's important to note that while things are getting better, we can see here by the data that for Black students, that's not the reality. And overall, there's been 2 million suspensions, overall, a huge increase in overall suspensions, over 2 million in 2009 of 100,000 expelled. So this racial disparity is growing. And I think that's important to note because oftentimes we get painted a picture that things are getting better. But as we can see from this data, and right, this doesn't include, we still need an updated on that figure, right, for the last 14 years, but it's getting worse.
So we also wanted to offer this this graph. So this is data from 2013, 2014, right? And we see here, right, the rate of out of school suspensions. And this is from the National Center for Education Statistics, right? And you see the disparities, right? And the overrepresentation of students who receive out of school suspensions by race. Here you see that Black students make up 13.7% of the population, but Black males, right, are 17.6% of the students who receives out of school suspension. Females, 9.6, right? They are overrepresented in this data. Followed by, again, like Yesenia said, American, Indian, Alaska Native, right? So Indigenous students are also overrepresented in the data, even though they're only 6.7%. So really just trying to show you a visual, right, of the disparities and the overrepresentation or underrepresentation of some folks, in correlation to the to the population that they actually represent.
And so this information here, going deeper right into suspension rates, this is from the Community College Equity Assessment Lab and the UCLA Black Male Institute. So again, as Black students in California specifically make up 5.7% of the population, they make up 12.8% of suspensions. And then if we look deeper into some other situations, we can see that suspension rates for Black foster students in California rises to 27.4%. So you can see that it's getting larger and larger. And then I think one of the most disheartening pieces for us in the research was to kind of see, how young students are really being affected. And we can see in this green figure here that Black boys in K through 3 are 5.6 times more likely to be suspended than their white counterpart. Black students with disabilities are 2 times more likely to be suspended. And so I think it's important to also ground, what we're talking about in our own context, right, in California, and how this is a problem that sometimes we can see the national rates, but seeing what's actually happening in California is super important because it affects.
Right, and something really to highlight here, and when we're grounding it within a California context, which populations are really the ones that are most vulnerable and most targeted, right? As we get more specific, between groups, we see, Black males are represented, Black males with disabilities. So as you add the layers of intersectional layers, you really get to see which the most vulnerable populations that are being targeted and funneled into the juvenile system. One point that I wanted to add here is actually Black and brown students with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be arrested, right? So they're 2 times more likely to be suspended, but an added layer to that, 3 times more likely to be arrested than their counterparts that don't have disabilities and are not Black or brown. Right, so when we're speaking about suspension rates, being suspended matters and has very real implications. So being suspended, there's increased likeliness to be retained, right? So then at that point, the student, is not able to go along with their peers, right? They're retained in school, loss of motivation. This causes a push out of the schools, right? And it decreases the chance that students graduate. So suspensions have very real implications. So when we're thinking about disciplinary actions for students, and if that path is leading to suspension, realizing that could have very large impacts on their futures. So now we wanted to make the correlation between suspension rates and imprisonment. So in this figure here, you see different numbers. So I'll start with on the left-hand side. So here you have a representation of females, right? So Black females make up 25.9% of the population. I'm sorry, make up 5.6% of the population, but are 25.9% of people in prison. So Black females are 5.7 times more likely than their white female counterparts to be imprisoned. On the right-hand side, we see that data for men. So again, Black folks make up 5.6% of the population in the country, but Black men are 28.5% of those imprisoned and are 10 times more likely to be imprisoned than their white counterparts. At that rate, Latino men are 2.4 times more likely to be imprisoned than white men. But even still, Black men are still 4 times more likely to be imprisoned than Latino men. So you get to see, right, the disparate rates. And I have some other data here. So California actually spends more on prisons than any other state in the country. California can actually afford to send 5 children to school for every 1 prisoner. So it goes to show you also how much money and resources are invested and spent on prisons as opposed to schooling. And just earlier today, we saw a brief from the Justice Policy Institute. And the cost, so then when we're talking about incarceration of youth, right, the cost to incarcerate 1 youth is $304,259, as opposed to an average in-state tuition rate in California, which is about $10,000. So we can see the difference, right? We can see how much money is being put into schools versus how much money is being put into prison. So when the discussion becomes like, well, we can't afford to pay tuition for students, we can't afford to put in more money into schools, why is the conversation not then why is all this money then being funneled into the criminal justice system? And we're able to see, right, folks are being pushed out of school into the criminal justice system when more resources can be allocated into our schools and we could disrupt that pipeline.
One piece I think is super important in discussing this is talking about the cycle and consequences of incarceration. Each year, more than 600,000 individuals are released from state and federal prisons, and another 9 million cycle through local jails. And more than two-thirds of prisoners are rearrested within 3 years of their release, and half are reincarcerated. So we can see there's this like harsh cycle here happening in our nation where it's really hard to kind of get out of the prison system. And some of the consequences here that I think is important to know is, once you enter the prison system, there's voter disenfranchisement. Folks can't vote anymore, depending on what kind of offense they committed, as well as they're disqualified from educational financial benefits, disqualified for medical housing benefits and welfare, also have limited employment opportunities. And I think this all kind of plays together to show that once you leave the system, it's really hard to find your footing in society. And we have a large narrative that we have in our country about, once you do your time and pay your time by being there, that you should be able to start your life again. And we can see through the numbers that that's not really happening. And it all leads back to this cycle of reincarceration. And I think one important note for California is to understand that in 2018, California enacted a law setting the minimum age of 12 for children to enter the juvenile court system. And so I think it's important also not to forget that our youth are going to jail. There are in the system already, and there's really heavy consequences. We've alluded to it before too, but there's mental health consequences. They're more likely to stay in the system, and the majority of the students who, especially in California, who are actually in juvenile detention, are not there for violent offenses. And so we're going to be sharing some links at the end so you can get deeper into the data because we can't cover everything. But so you can look into some of that information as well. But I think this point is really important because it feels like a harsh, never-ending cycle where folks can't enter and leave. It's they're set up to failure in a lot of ways to leave the system and not be able to get resources afterwards to make a new life. And if we have our students entering, our youth entering so early in the system, it's really hard for them to get out. And they all end up having to pay the price for that for in their futures.
So Yesenia and I also, instead of, like I said, doing a lot of the talking, we wanted to have a visual representation of what this looks like. So we put together these images and these headlines, which are from the last 3 years of instances of children being arrested at schools, right? So it really gets us to think about what policing in schools looks like, right? How there is a correlation between police at schools, police now taking over disciplinary actions versus the school handling classroom management and discipline and behavior, and the fact that 6-year-olds are being arrested, right? Yesenia mentioned that in California, it's students as young as 12 can enter the juvenile justice system. In other states, actually, in 15 states across the country, that age number is actually 10. In 15 states, 10-year-olds can enter the juvenile justice system. And in one state, which is North Carolina, that number is as low as 6. So 6 years old can enter the juvenile justice system. So if y'all could just kind of take a look, read through these headlines, because this is the reality. This is what's happening. I just went onto Google, looked up, school policing, children arrest, and this is what came up. So just take a moment to take a look at those and just observe, maybe even write down some thoughts that you have about this. Okay, now we're going to continue.
I think it's hard, to see those headlines and see the faces of these children. And I think That's one thing that struck us over and over again when we're doing this, digging deeper into this, to kind of pivot a little bit more into some concerns that folks have in schools, in terms of having police there. There's a lack of evidence that shows that police in schools equals safety. So that's a big piece there, right? Oftentimes that's the narrative that is spoken about. Also, there's poor oversight in police involvement in schools. There's a lack of formal guidelines for police involvement. And there's also, like we mentioned earlier with the data, increased criminalization of school discipline, and an escalation of incidents with legal concerns, that ultimately have long-term consequences, for students and their records. So I think that's one thing that really surprised. Well, I wouldn't say surprised, but I would say it was interesting to see the data of how much having a school police officer on campus, really affected the rates of how students were treated, specifically Black and Brown students. And so this is an important piece that there's a lot of work going on, currently, to have deeper conversations, to have reform, to change some of these policies happening in schools.
So we see, right, when disciplinary actions or classroom management are handed over to the police as opposed to administration, you start seeing the criminalization of just youthful action. So pushing and shoving becomes battery, right? Um, Swiping some headphones becomes theft or robbery. Talking back is disorderly conduct. So the terminology, the way folks are talked about, the way this is written down in reports, takes on a much more criminal approach, as opposed to, yeah, they're 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, they had a scuffle, right? But now they're being charged for battery. These are very real consequences that are left on their school records, on their records as adults, right? That can have consequences for the future.
And also, to get a little bit deeper into student perspectives, there was a survey of students from, large California school districts. And there, 61% of white students agreed that they felt safer around police officers at their school, but only 41% of Black students said the same. And we have data from kind of other states and kind of their response there. But I think one of the most important things here is that the perspectives and attitudes of students and how they see police at that early age actually tracks as they grow older, and really mirrors kind of the adult, perspective on police. So I think that's important to say, that we should be taking in account the perspective of our students and how they feel, and what does safety mean for them in school, and what do those police officers, really represent to them. As we know, police officers have very different, relationships with different communities, and so that often, affects students. And so they may be having, encounters with police, in their daily lives that actually follow them right as they go into school. And so that all meshes together, because, their lives, don't happen kind of in a silo, like we were saying. What happens in their community really affects what happens in their schools. And so understanding kind of that relationship there is super important, and to give our students more of a voice to share how they feel around, police officers at school.
And then something just also to mention, when looking at surveys, when looking at research, when looking at data, it's also very important to see who conducted the research, right? Who funded that research and that data, because that could widely affect the perspective that's being portrayed. And really just try and understand like whose point is really coming across, who's being represented. That's also very important when we're analyzing this data and what it is that they have to report.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're gonna jump into, I think, one of our, this is a really important slide, very heavy slide. I mean, this whole presentation is heavy, but this particular one, because, we are talking about, like overall in this presentation, the educator's role in disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And something that's very important for us to think about, to look into, is what we think as educators. So in this slide, we really wanted to see what's happening in the classroom and what's the research of what research has been conducted, right? So there is this research study that was conducted by a standard psychology department. And in their research, they found that teachers are likely to interpret students' misbehavior differently depending on their race. So in this research study, they were able to find that uh, Black students are stereotyped as troublemakers and are disciplined more harshly after 2 infractions. So for Black students, when they misbehave twice, that is now considered a pattern. And teachers did say that they would consider harsher punishment or even suspension, because now that label has stuck as a troublemaker, as opposed to their white counterparts, where that behavior is not necessarily considered a pattern and is not seen as disruptive or as threatening compared to Black and Brown students, right? So we see, right, teachers did report that they were more likely to resort to harsher punishment, to suspension. Um, and the stereotype of troublemaker, follows the student. If we remember to that data that we presented earlier, Black students in K through 3 were 5.7 times more likely to be suspended. This, I think, is a research study that really is representative of that. What do we think about students, and then how do we categorize and think about their behaviors um, early on, and that follows them throughout, right? So something that we really wanted to get at here is also just this rhetoric that surrounds Black students and Brown students. So, in the 90s, this term of super predator came to be, that really just, sprouted fear about Black youth, about Brown youth, as them being threatening, right? As them being criminals, that you should be afraid of them in your communities. Where a lot of politicians even use this term, right? And that was a reason for like their war on crime and war on poverty, like really you know feeding off of people's fears and criminalizing this group of youth, um, and continuing to criminalize them through the media. And it's something that we still see through this day. This term of super predator, even though it may not be used, you could still see the sentiment in news that we see up until a week ago, a day ago, right? So it's what we've been socialized to think about Black youth, Brown youth, and racializing and criminalizing their behavior. Um, and, Yesenia and I really wanted to bring it to current context, right? Of, just a few weeks ago during the Derek Chauvin trial of his murder of George Floyd, a 16-year-old Black female was killed, 4 shots, killed. A 13-year-old Latino boy was also murdered on the street, right? So just to put it into that context, right? These youth are still being criminalized. They're being seen as threatening, right? When other folks, right, in other instances, like the 70-year-old white man who shot 2 protesters was walking with a rifle, the police was able to stop him without shooting at him and provide him with water, right? The 21-year-old who shot Asian women in Atlanta, who was able to go to 3 different locations, came out of that with his life. You see, right? Because the argument is like, well, they had a weapon, right? Is rationalizing, she had a knife. But in our minds, how are we socialized to think about folks, and why do certain folks come out dead and certain folks come out of life in those situations? So, in this presentation, we know it's heavy to highlight something like this, but we think it would have been a disservice not to mention it and not to bring that to light, because there are things that are happening in our everyday life. So as educators, what is it? What are the ideologies that we have? What are the implicit bias that we have that may be affecting the way that we are approaching student behavior within our classrooms, right? So we're really calling on this, internal reflection and internal process, because it matters. We see the implications, we see the consequences, and we can disrupt it. We could do something about that. Yes, I don't know if you'd like to add something to this as well.
No, I think Gabby did a really good job of kind of explaining kind of where our head was in understanding that we're in a very critical time right now where so many things are happening. And, you know, what's happening in our communities is really representative of a larger structure. And when we talk about this, we can't talk about it without talking about that. And so we really want to hold space for that. And also, like we mentioned, it's heavy to talk about these things, but that's why we need to talk about them, because it's so important for us to do this work, and you showing up here and this is a really good step towards that.
Right. So which brings us to this slide, right? You know, I'm a person of color, I'm an ally, I'm a teacher of color, right? You know, I've lived in these communities my whole life, right? Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure you're doing great work. We still call on you all to do critical reflection because it's an ongoing internal and external process within yourself, right? Really getting to analyze what ideologies we have about our own communities, about other communities, where we're working in. And after doing that internal reflection, you know, speaking to other folks about it, right? As teachers of color, as educators of color, we're not exempt from this process, right? The way we are socialized, the way we are bombarded by media every single day, um, everyone internalizes stereotypes about their own groups and other community groups, right? So rather than denying that as human beings we are flawed and have bias, right, and being defensive or engaging in denial, that won't be as productive in us affecting positive change and disrupting systems like the pipeline. Um, so it is committing to doing that work, and it is committing to doing something heavy and something like highly vulnerable and emotional. But if we truly want to serve our students well, um, it's 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 a process that is ongoing, something that we have to continuously be examining and work to unlearn, and be proactive in the process in undoing and unlearning that bias that may be affecting the way we conduct our classrooms, the way we conduct our presentations, the way we advocate for students, to our administration, the way we advocate for certain professional development, and everything and that we do. Um, so that's just something we really wanted to be intentional about. The fact that critical and ongoing reflection is important. Uh, and our first step to then taking further action, to be advocates, and to be what is it, active uh, community members of change, right?
Yeah, I think like Gabby mentioned, you know, this work it's not easy work to do. But one thing that kind of really in my mind that stays as a mantra, right, is that educators can't just be non-racist, they must be anti-racist, right? And so this idea of we need to back up what we believe in with action, and to stand up when things happen, and to make our voices heard. And so this is really the mantra that we have in doing this work, and in talking about the school to prison pipeline also is, you know, understanding this, but also making changes, that critical reflection within ourselves to understand how we came to this place now, and how we can work back and change things for the better for all our students. And again, you know, this isn't just for teachers, right? So this applies to every context. Gabby and I are educators who work with future teachers, specifically with future Latinx teachers. And so we do this work, engaging in critical reflection and the way that we interact with our students, but also in able to really help our students learn the tools to how to do this in their practice on their way to become teachers in the future. So I think this quote just really spoke to me, and I really wanted to, you know, emphasize that this is kind of the work that we're aiming towards, to doing the hard work, because we care so much about this, right? We wouldn't be here if we didn't care about this work and we didn't care about our students. And so how can we do it, and how can we learn and grow through this process as well?
So something that I wanted to present, is there's this article written by Dr. Tyrone Howard, and in it he speaks about, you know, pre-service teachers and preparing them to work in urban schools and in schools with students of color. And in it he says that he really emphasizes this piece of critical reflection and some questions that pre-service teachers, educators should ask themselves, right, to really help them reflect and work through the process. So I have put the questions here. Please feel free to take a picture with your phone, right, or a screenshot, so you all can maybe take these questions and journal with them. Start having that internal dialogue, and after that, discuss them with somebody else. Um, so please feel free to do that and take these with you. We won't be going over these individually in this session, but we really wanted to offer them to you all as beginning questions and tools for that critical reflection that we feel is so important.
So now that we've had a chance to kind of get through so much information, so much data, and just kind of start that reflection process, we did want to open the again to talk a little bit about what now after hearing all this, what are the underlying elements that allow for the school to prison pipeline to thrive. And we have some kind of different contexts, right? Personal, societal, cultural, structural, ideological. So I'm gonna be putting that link again in the chat. And we have some time to kind of dig into this here. So we're excited about that, to have some time to just look through that. And at the end, we definitely share resources for everyone who want more information, and we'll go through that as well. But I think having a space where we can, have a discussion together through Jamboard is really important for us. So I'm sharing the link a few times. So if everyone can jump onto the Jamboard, we'll get started there. And so it's on the second slide. So on the top, there's a little arrow and you're gonna click there. And then if Gabby, you can pull up the Jamboard and then.
So as you are all thinking about this too, we are going to split you up into breakout rooms where you all can discuss these elements. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms. And if you can think about this question, right? What are the structural elements that allow the school to prison pipeline to thrive, right? What are the interpersonal elements, right? So please, jot down these 4 elements. We'll make sure to put it out in a message while you're in breakout rooms as well. We're really trying to dig into the discussion and really unpack how all these contribute to the school to prison pipeline to thrive. And thrive tends to be a positive word, but in this case, like, what keeps the school to prison pipeline alive, and what does it feed off of? So we're gonna go ahead and put you into breakout rooms and open those up. Yesenia, if you're able to do that. And then as you all are discussing, feel free to come back to this Jamboard to post your thoughts. And then we'll come back after that and we'll have a general discussion and ask groups what they shared with each other.
So we'll have around, I think, 10 minutes to kind of dig into this, and then so we have some time when we come back. So we have a variety of rooms open right now, and you should be getting the prompt. Okay, I think you should be getting, I know we have some people still left here. You should be able to, you should be getting a prompt to allow you to go and join a breakout room. And then I'm going to send everyone.
Okay, you got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Let me see. I know some folks might not be able to join a room just given if they're on a phone or something, and that's totally fine. Is anyone who's with us right here having trouble joining, or do they want us to send you another message, or are you okay? Just don't want to leave you out. Okay, I'm assigning people left and right, so you get a prompt. That is why. Gabby, do you want to ask everyone to come back?
Like, has it been
Does that
10
work?
minutes?
No, at 1:10, I'm saying.
Okay, yeah.
Gabby, I think I'm just going to look through questions to see if there's something we want to circle back to because I think I saw some in there.
Yeah, for sure. I'll go through them as well. All right, folks, sit tight. We have about 3 minutes before people in breakout rooms will come back to the main room, right? If you had a chance or were able to reflect or think about the question that we posed, feel free to, when we come back to general discussion, to please input and engage.
Okay, I think I'm going to close the room. So I think give us a minute.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Do you want me to leave it on this page or go to the presentation?
I like this page.
Okay.
Welcome to everyone who's coming back from the breakout rooms. We hope you had some good conversation.
You know, as everyone gets back, it should be like 30 seconds. We'll jump into a general discussion with everyone.
Seeing some good feedback about the breakout rooms.
Yeah, thank you. I think most everyone is back. I think we started at around 75 folks that went into breakout rooms.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're all back. We have a big group of people, 61. So like we mentioned in the message, if you chose someone who wants to share, to talk a little bit about what was shared in that group, that would be great. And if you want to add that to the Jamboard, that'd be great too. So we can kind of have a living space where we can come back to look at everything that was shared in this space. So if you are chosen and you want to speak up first, you can raise your hand or let us know, and then we can have you unmute.
Yes, the floor is yours.
Who's going to be the first person?
I could go. Hi.
Hi, thank you.
I guess first and foremost, hello everybody. My group.
Hello.
My group. We went over a lot of what was put into your presentation, which is really good, by the way. It's amazing. It's given us a lot of insight. One of our group members actually brought up that they had noticed that there were 60 participants within this Zoom, and that it's bottom line just not enough. Not a lot of people are talking about this situation. I saw somebody write that on the Jamboard too. It's just something that's not talked about, but it exists, and it's definitely not just in our schools. Another group member of mine also said that it starts within communities, and I couldn't agree more. It's not just one area where this happens. It's not just because of the increased policing in school. It's because of systemic racism. It's because of what these communities are teaching their children based off of what they know or based off of what they've seen. And it's definitely damaging. I mean, how could you not see what's going on? And we definitely did not agree with how it's going, how it started, and where it looks like it's heading.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Lena. And it's one of those things, like once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? So it's really about, you know, in presentations like this, raising awareness so more folks can can see it, and then we can act together towards change. So yes, 100%. Thank you. Would anyone else like to go?
I would, if you don't mind. Hello, my name is Madeline. I really enjoy what you guys are talking about and racism with public schools. I really think that it's great that you guys are discussing this. But I think what my group talked about was the lack of schools teaching the history of Black lives, like in the past, because um, I didn't move to California until around my senior year of high school. But I lived in the suburbs of Illinois before, and what's very unfortunate is I lived in like a conservative town, kind of, and we didn't learn about the true meaning of Black lives and what happened in the past and like all the darkness. And I really feel like schools lack that. Like, I know it can be scary for younger kids, and I understand that, but I feel like as the kids move on, like around middle school or maybe high school, I think it would be more important for those students to learn about the history before moving on to college and really knowing more about that darkness, so that they're not frightened. Because it's definitely sad once you move on to college and you're thinking, I never knew about this, because they should know before they move on.
History has been whitewashed, unfortunately. And with the whitewashing of our history, we have lost generational stories, treasure troves of information. Inequality and unequal access to education have done severe damage as well. But it's that whitewashing of history, just showing history from the white perspective. I mean, think about when we look at Manifest Destiny. It's the white man's destiny to go across the country and populate from shore to shore. What about the people who are already here? And we don't hear about it. I mean, my child didn't hear about the Trail of Tears at school. They heard about it from me. So the whitewashing and portraying of history from the victor's perspective is something that we need to address, as well as unequal access to education.
Yes, 100%. And I also saw Keisha, please, you raise your hand.
Oh, I'm just, I was voluntold that I would be the speaker for my group. We talked about many things, but I will say that overall, we were appreciative of the pictures. And some people shared they remembered those stories from the news and so on. But, you know, we all we're very visual, most of us. And I think continuing to put the pictures before us and continuing to talk about it and not letting it be the worst kept secret. We also shared some solutions along with how it continues to happen. And so in some of those solutions, we talked about counselors beyond just curriculum counselors or guidance counselors, but real counselors like who are social, emotional, counselors who are trauma informed. We talked about nurses and medical staff in every program. We talked about one of the things we didn't say, but I would say is starting at the preschool level and elementary level and not just having counselors in middle school and high school, because what we know from research is you need to catch them before third grade or catch whatever's happening in their lives. We also talked about the path that teachers take. Many times credentialed teachers is liberal studies and single subject studies. And sometimes they don't get those pieces about development, like atypical development, typical development, or asking the questions, what's happening in that child's life? You know, what happens? Did that child have breakfast this morning? You know, what's going on? And instead of just putting a child out in a classroom or outside. And I shared that according to Dr. Howard and Wood, that the new suspension now is actually putting children in the hallway or by the principal's office. So you're still, so you can still account them for being present at the school, because if you suspend them, they are now absent. So, but that doesn't serve any purpose for a child or anyone else. And it doesn't support the teacher, the child. And then what does that say to the other kids? So this is the part I think that people sometimes forget about. So now this child has been singled out by the adults, but in many cases, that child is singled out by their peers now because of what the adults or what they've seen the adults say, do, etc. So now they're getting a double whammy. So now I don't have support from peers, I don't have support from the adults, and so on. So really thinking about preventions and making a difference. And then I think it was Carmen and a couple other people in the group who said, we shared, yes, the administrators need to do something and know something, but each of us can start one pebble. We can start in our class. You can do one thing one day. And I just shared that, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And so that first step has to be you. And like, even though there was 75 and now 59 of us, you came to this workshop. So like you said, you can't unsee it and you can't unhear it. So now what are you going to do?
Yes, definitely. And thank you for sharing. That gets us into the conversation of where resources are allocated, right? Loss of instruction. They may not be suspended, but if they're losing instruction, that has a lot of implications as well, right? Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Anybody else? Maybe 2 more minutes. Yesenia and I do have some recommendations and some things that we want to show you to close the presentation. So 2 more minutes if anyone else would like to share what they spoke in their breakout room.
It's probably easiest if you raise your hand. If not, then I might move forward.
Like, that is so odd. Those are the lines from the Jamboard and they stayed on the presentation. Okay, cool. I think we could go ahead then and continue. Thank you all for engaging with us, for engaging in your breakout rooms. We're getting to the finish line. It's 1:20. So we didn't want to leave this presentation without any hope or recommendations or things that we could start looking toward or, researching more about different practices. We did get that question in the chat, like, what do you do, right? So it's looking to each other for different tools, like Keisha shared, right? And looking to each other, like, what are other folks doing that is working, right? So yeah, we're gonna go into some recommendations for you all.
Perfect. So I think one thing here too is just we're going into how can we disrupt this, right? What recommendations do we have? And so we put some resources here. There's a restorative justice practices toolkit that is really useful. That talks a little bit more about classroom management in a restorative justice sense versus a traditional discipline in classrooms. Also, I think talking about creating teacher groups, right, on your campus to discuss different classroom management styles and strategies. Connecting yourself with social media groups that are focused on restorative justice has been really helpful for me. And I think there's so much that we can be learned by working with each other and supporting each other in that way. Also, I think understanding what community you're joining, right, and doing the research into the demographics and what's going on in that community, because each school and each community is so different. And so making sure you're investing in that is super important. And then, talking more about how can we get school funding to get additional support for training on restorative justice practices, as well as creating better bonds with our parents of color to create honest dialogue and mutual support. So these are just some things, there's a lot more, and definitely if you have recommendations and you want to put that in the chat from folks who are in this space already and have some experience in this, we welcome that. And I think Gabby's going to share a little bit more of some things she wants to share.
Yeah. And like Yesenia and I said, we are definitely not experts. We are 2 staff members from this project who really just wanted to raise awareness for our own students who are undergraduates or pre-service teachers, and this kind of snowballed into us presenting in other spaces. So we thank you for, for coming today. These are not exhaustive lists. we don't know the answer to everything, but we definitely just wanted to make sure we opened it up for discussion so folks can start thinking about this, or continuing, right, thinking about this. So for my recommendations, there's this organization called Learning for Justice, and they have compiled social justice standards that you can implement with your classroom. Within your classroom, and they focus on 4 different areas. They focus on identity, diversity, justice, and action. So they have broken up these topics and they have provided standards across grade levels. So you can start working with your students early on, right, on how they can start thinking about their own identity, their identity of their peers, right, how they can start delving into diversity and what that looks like, justice, right, when they can speak up, when it's safe to speak up, what they can start doing, right, and action. So at starting from kindergarten, I'm pretty sure their standards go from K through 12. How is it that you can start implementing these topics, speaking with your students about it? And it's just something that is going to make them critical thinkers from the very beginning and really get them to be, agents for themselves, and very, part of their own educational journey. Something else that we recommend is, as a teacher, you can look into what kind of partnerships your school has with the police department, really setting like stipulations or protocols for what they can and cannot do on campus. That's a place to start. Really outlining and providing explanations for infractions, right, or what responses are to different behaviors, so things could be less subjective, right? And just like teacher training and professional learning opportunities for folks to shift from more deficit perspectives to more positive behaviors, to more additive community cultural wealth perspectives. Because we really believe that a shift in ideology can make all the difference, right? So if you notice like, oh, what I just said is coming from a deficit perspective and it's impacting how I take these actions in my classroom, that shift, that unlearning and shift to a more positive or additive perspective can make all the difference, right? Rather than making your students sit aside in the classroom, maybe I should speak to this student after class, really investigate what's going on. If there's stuff going on at home, like someone said earlier, maybe they just didn't have breakfast, and we all know how we get when we get hangry. I know I do not function when I'm hungry, right? So just it's a series of things. Like there's more things at play rather than just student is choosing to be disrespectful. But in this, presentation, we just really wanted to highlight the ideological piece and the critical reflection piece as a starting point for building towards action and to positive change. So like Yesenia said earlier, we have compiled a list of resources and, the studies that we referenced in our presentation. 13th on Netflix is a documentary we recommend for all to watch. So we'll make sure that we get these out to you all if you want to take a picture with your phone. I'm not sure how or if we're able to.
I think we have your, if you're on the Zoom meeting, we can email you this as well.
Okay.
And then we'll also put in our information there so we can definitely keep in contact or if you have questions. But definitely want to share all this with you all.
So that's actually it for us. Thank you all for joining us, right, for being with us this hour and a half. And, thank you for your openness and willingness to continue to do this work in our schools.
Yeah, thank you for everyone for just being here and for taking this time with us and had such great insights from everyone. And so we really appreciate it. We started off with 11 people registered. And so then we had, I think at the most 80 people in this space, which is amazing. And so the information that's shared here is something that you carry with you and that you can share with other people as well. And so we really value you in that piece because this is a community effort, us working together. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. Enjoy your afternoon.
We'll stay on here for a little bit if y'all have questions.
Thank you for the wonderful information. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Carmen.
Thank you so much for all the information. Finally, I know I have idea how to write my research paper.
Good. We're glad.
Yeah, because I was taking English 1A and my professor was like, we're reading the New Dream Quote books. So we talk about all these things already. So it's a good information. Thank you.
I'm glad we could
Thank you,
help
Anna.
during finals times.
Perfect. So yeah, folks have questions. We're happy to answer, or if not, have a good day.